Welcome everybody to the last CREASE noon seminar of the semester. My name is Christina Farivari. I'm the acting director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and I'm happy to present to you today our speaker, Natalia Pushkareva, who is at the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow in the Institute of Ethnology and Anthropology, where she is professor, a leading research fellow, and also directs the Women's and Gender Studies Department. Natalia is an extremely accomplished and prolific scholar. She has pages of publications, 30 books to her name, 10 of which are monographs, and I'm just going to list two. Some of the most notable: Private Life of a Russian Woman, Bride, Wife, Lover, which was published in 1997, and another monograph published in 2007, Gender Theory and Historical Knowledge. So I would like you to join me in welcoming Natalia Pushkareva for a talk today called Feminism in Russia.
We have to go to my presentation, and I don't know.
That's okay. I'll get it.
Yes. Yep.
And should I just go ahead and start the slideshow?
Yes. Okay. So, dear colleagues, the whole history of Russian feminism, from the foundation of the first women's organizations to the present, is difficult to put forth in a short paper. This theme attracted me many years ago, long before the modern discussion in women and gender issues. The results of these primary short investigations, source investigations, appeared in articles and monographs published in Russian and also in English. That's why today I would invite you to contemplate in general the difficult and contradictory social, economic, and intellectual factors that influenced women's movement in Russia during 2 centuries. Background or prehistory of the Russian feminism takes its roots in the 18th century, when the Russian society found itself under the influence of the Great French Revolution of 1789. The most progressive representatives of the Russian society followed the events in France, where the overall demand for doing away with despotism was joined by the voice of women. Russian women of the privileged classes openly influenced politics and participated in public life. Among the rulers of Russia in the 18th century, 5 were women, 1 regent, and 4 rulers. Empress Catherine the Great may be regarded as a model governmental activist, adroit, proficient, and successful. Grand Duchess Catherine Dashkova towers among the figures of the 18th century Enlightenment, a finely educated woman who spoke 14 languages. She became the president of the Russian Academy of Sciences and Academy of Arts. Catherine the Great and Catherine Dashkova certainly were exceptional, but also the literary horizon witnessed appearance of women writers and poets. Together with women's literature and female autobiographies, it signified the birth of social female self-consciousness. In early 19th century Russia, the woman question arose primarily as a move to improve women's social and familial position. Women's active participation in politics developed under this rubric. The first political organization for women, the Женское патриотическое общество, the Women's Patriotic Society, was formed in 1812 during the Patriotic War with Napoleon. It was later called the first women's organization meant to achieve social goals. The women's movement continued with female participation in secret Decembrist societies, organizations which staged an abortive attempt to establish democracy or constitutional government in Russia in 18 25, the Decembrists who believed in democracy held that women should be equal participants in a democratic society. The wives and sisters of Decembrists, of those arrested and sent to exile in Siberia, you can see these women, took the lead in educational and benevolent work far away from the capital. It was an important step towards the development of equal participation of women in public life. They set up public libraries in Siberia, medical help facilities, organized lectures and concerts. By living their life, they created a model of non-family public initiative. Defending the ideas of female equality, they followed their own difficult path of self-discovery and self-determination. The crystallization of female collective consciousness in Russia was fostered not just of the women who fit well in social and cultural context of the times, but the ones who fell out. The best Russian poet of the 19th century, Alexander Pushkin, called them the lawless comets in the clear circle of planets. Those who blew up traditional stereotypes, who caused scandals by how they acted, they contribute to the course of the liberation of the individual by breaking the old moral criteria, by forcing to reconsider the old ideas. Some of Lawless comets were well-educated persons. They supported the ideas of modernizing Russian autocratic system and wished to take part in discussing such issues. Their disputes, tightly knit into high society flirtations, presented a way of introducing provincial and urban women to public life. The Crimean War, middle of the 19th century, proved to be quite significant in fostering Russian women's search for ways and means to apply themselves outside of the family. It was during that war that the Russian Public Health Service was established. Women played an important role in it as female nurses. Their activity personified the road of women's self-emancipation. In the early 1850s, progressively minded Russian intellectuals became quite competent with the Western debate on women's equality. As a result of it, a number of works were produced by liberal Russian professors. Psychologist Ilya Sechenov, historian Timofey Granovsky and his article looking at changing of civil status of women in our homeland was based on Western experience. Or outstanding surgeon Nikolai Pirogov, whose unpublished work, An Ideal of a Woman, was distributed in handwritten form, being read and over again. But Gloria and reputation of someone who actually raised the women's issue in Russia belongs also for men to criticist Mikhail Mikhailov, one of the contributors of the magazine Contemporary. In 1852, he wrote an essay, Women, Their Upbringing, a Role in Family and Society, which voiced the demand for women equality in social and political life. Thanks to this article, women's issue gained its civic right in literature, and from that time on was perceived not as a separate problem, but as one of the manifestations of social ills. Many issues to the emancipation of women in general attracted attention in the mid-19th century. Women's liberation became one of the most hotly debated issues in fiction and literary criticism, the only genres in which could escape the strict governmental censorship. The beginning of women's movement in Russia was related to efforts to provide women with opportunities for professional occupations and economic independence. Secondly, it was connected to struggle for access to higher education. The first stage of Russian women's movement covers the period from 1859 to 1905. In 1859, three women, Maria Trubnikova, Anna Filosofova, and Nadezhda Stasova, came up with an idea to create a society for delivering inexpensive apartments in St. Petersburg. At early stage of existence of this feminist triumvirate, these women, together with other supporters, carried out a broad range of philanthropic and educational activities. In 1861, the first Women's Labor Association in St. Petersburg, the Society of Women's Labor, was established. In 1863, Maria Trubnikova and other two women set up a women's publishing guild in Russian capital, and so on. So inspired by ideas of enlightenment, Russian intelligentsia of different ranks tried to present the right of education as a starting point to any emancipation, including that of women. However, the access to higher education remained the critical issue. Young women found their way into universities to attend lectures, formed their own sessions during which lectures on medicine and science were read aloud. Some of women activists achieved the opening of private, so non-state, women's courses. In 1867, Maria Trubnikova, Nadezhda Stasova, and 100 other noble women signed a petition addressed to the Dean of St. Petersburg University to allow women to attend lectures. During the following 3 years, the same group of activists developed more and more appeals, and not without success. In 1870, Vladimir courses were set in St. Petersburg. In 1872, courses at the Military Medical Academy training women doctors and midwives were opened also in St. Petersburg, and so on. But if they wanted to complete their education, Russian women had to travel abroad, first and foremost to Germany and Swiss. In these European universities, Russian female students were in constant contact with the ideas of Western feminism. These ideas were exported to Russia by these very women who later on helped to set up underground political groups. Having completed a course of in sciences in Russia or abroad, women would often experience difficulties finding employment. Even a special organization, Society for Assisting the Graduates of Courses in Sciences, initiated by Nadezhda Stasova in 1893, was not capable of providing job opportunities to everybody. So about Bestuzhev-Ryumin and about the courses that were founded in St. Petersburg. So some words about differences and similarities in the history of Russian and Western feminism. Russian and Western feminism had a lot of common. Financially secure women from the big cities' capitals were the ones who initiated women's movement in Russia. These well-to-do representatives of the educated society voluntarily donated their funds to public needs. Third, the social composition of women's movement in Russia gradually changed from the more well-to-do to poor. The new women were characterized by a downward social mobility, loss of contact with their own environment, refuse from the norms of behavior of their social group of origin. Everything was sorted through. It was a common saying of the times. Fourth, the age composition. One could see at that time even young ladies dreaming to get rid of parental guardianship and the yoke of the family. And fifth, striving to civil and political rights to be granted to them, the first Russian feminists viewed education and free choice of occupation as the means to obtain all these rights. Despite many similarities, The origins of the Russian feminism had its own specificity. First of all, the juridical status of Russian women in regard to property and inheritance surpassed that of most women in Europe. Wives in all social classes had rights to property, specifically 1/14 of the husband's real property and 1/7 of movables. Daughters who had the right to the fixed percentage of the inheritance. Among other European women, such rights were either limited or non-existent. That's why in Russia, main debates were going on around the right to divorce and keep separate living arrangements with their husbands, not about inheritance or property. Second, significant property rights of Russian women made it possible for them to donate money and decide independently what to spend their riches on. Female entrepreneurship originated in Russia in the second half of the 19th century. Third, Western feminists attempted to separate themselves from the male hierarchy and create their own system free of autocracy and hierarchies. Russian women's activists did not posit themselves against men. They planned to use existing social structures and movements established by men to achieve their goals. And fourth, Russian women who joined the feminist movement could not raise the issue about women's political rights because in autocratic Russia, many social groups had no political rights. In that regard, women were socially equal to men. Prohibition of women's organization in 80s, during the time of especially political reactionary rule in Russia, became a measure that affected other public organizations as well. And the last one, there was no way for Russian feminist movement to become a mass one in the 19th century and even in the early 20s, before the Russian Revolution 1905. Russian feminists had no representatives in state structures and organizations, and hence no opportunities to lobby and exert constant pressure over the authorities. We can also speak about close link between literature, public life, and real life. It is another characteristic feature of Russian social movements. Feminism was no exception. Right after the novel of Nikolai Chernyshevsky, What is to be Done, was published, women's labor associations and communes started to appear. Personal and family conflicts were now resolved in the manner to that of the novel's characters. Next one. Russian feminists paid less attention to the issues of sexes and sexuality than their Western counterparts. Seventh. Most early Russian feminists were good with pen, both prose and poetry. In Ukraine, the feminist movement of the second part of the 19th century was represented exclusively by female writers. Eighth. In the West, idolization of women as the embodiment of femininity was incomparably more pronounced than in Russia. Russian feminists viewed this cult of womanhood as a spiritual ghetto, silk snares that continued to keep women in their usual roles, those of seducers, wives, or housewives. The slogan, "Help by work," written on the house for educated women established in St. Petersburg 1896, could have been a motto for the whole Russian feminist movement in the 19th century. Next one. The charitable aspect of the Russian women's movement was also different from that in the West. Женское дело, Women's Matter magazine, established in 1900, proclaimed that the only rational form of charity should come in the form of providing assistance with jobs and not free aid. In Germany and France, charities were mostly preoccupied with teaching women how to become better housewives, mothers, or wives. Now how to keep their homes cleaner and so on. In Russia, feminists involved the charitable activities treated women as independent workers who were expected to rely on their own resources. Such forms of charity brought experience in leadership and higher self-esteem to their initiators. The 10th. Links between feminism and revolutionary democratic movements was also characteristic of Russia. Extreme leftist movements in Russia showed great interest to the women question. They recognized that their success or failure could lie in the support of women, who formed half the population. Women active in 1970s, семидесятницы, had become connected with the radical branch of Russian liberation. 1/5 of members of the radical organization Land and Freedom were women. 10 years later, Елена Чебышева-Дмитриева, Anna Shabanova, and Ariadna Tyrkova created first completely feminist association, Women's Enlightenment Society, and a little bit later, Moscow Society for Improvement of Women's Welfare. Thanks to them, a number of women's magazines were now being published in Russia. Женское дело, Women's Matter, Женская гигиена, Women's Hygiene, Женский вестник, Women's Herald, and so on. Established at the end of the 19th century, they were shut down by the Bolsheviks in 1918 as bourgeois organizations. Russian women's movement of 1905-1917 was well prepared both ideologically and organizationally. The revolutionary wave of 1905 summoned women who had been previously only demanding higher education and professional work to struggle for civil and political rights. In January 1905, about 30 women from St. Petersburg announced the creation of All-Russian Women's Equality Union, Союз равноправия женщин. It was the first in Russian history reunion in defense of women's political rights. So it is about this union also. In May 1905, during the first Congress of the Union, the delegates discussed their ideological platform. Recognition of rights of different ethnic groups in Russia, equality of women of all social strata with men and political and civil rights in all spheres of life, access for women in to all areas of social professional activity, co-education, abolition of prostitution laws that were humiliating the women's dignity, and so on. During that year, unions departments were set up in Moscow, Tver, Ryazan, and some other cities. The activists drew petitions to the cabinet of ministers asking to consider the issue of granting women equal suffrage. Parallel to that, unions branches were trying to establish connections with social democratic organizations, and in the fall of 1905, union was contacting Moscow Strike Committee that was representing the interests of workers. It is not accidental that the Bolsheviks devoted great attention to women's movement. With some justification, Vladimir Lenin suggested that without the participation of an enormous number of working women, the social revolution could not take place. In the meantime, Women's Equality Union was trying to propagate the idea of granting women equal rights to vote, and during 1906-1907 struggled for equality in political sphere. Women's Progressive Party, established 1907 and led by Maria Pokrovskaya, editor-in-chief of Zhezhsky Vestnik magazine, was also attempt to draw public attention to the problems of women's suffrage. The biggest event in the history of Russian women's movement was the summoning of the first of All-Russian Women's Congress on December 1908. More than 1,000 participants took part in it. The permission to hold the Congress was obtained in 1906, but it took 6 years to get ready. Russian feminists who got together at the Congress viewed, as it was said during the plenary sitting, charity, mutual support, aid in work matters, and education as their goals. However, the representatives of proletarian women's movement, led by Alexandra Kollontai, spoke against such unification of the goals. She referred to the liberals as bourgeois feminists and asked women not to be led by the charitable deems. Kollontai and her followers supported egalitarian interpretation of feminist tasks, so-called equality feminism, insisted on recognizing women as subjects of law. Liberal feminists Anna Shabanova, Ariadna Terkova, and others shared the concept of so-called feminism of differences. They argued that all women share universal social experience, that all women should not be compared to men, that differences of women versus men should be recognized, and women should have the right to be different. Some of her adepts, a number of activists, Olga Kirikova, Olga Shapira, and so on, thought that universal equality was only a manifestation of inequality. Only equality with difference, as was said by Olga Shapir, was the basis for complete and harmonious relations between sexes. The issues of all citizens of the country, men and women alike, being responsible for the fate of Russia and its development along the democratic route, was also discussed at the Congress. Women's Equality Union, numbered at this time 8,000 members, ceased its existence after the Congress. Its functions were now executed by the Russian League of Women Equality, Российская Лига равноправия женщин, which by 1914 had its local branches in more than 50 cities and towns across Russia. A Russian League of Women's Equality was aimed at propagating the idea of equality between genders. In 1910s, the activists of League Равноправки from Равноправный, equal in rights, took part in the work of the first All-Russian Congress on fighting against trade in women. In February 1913, Russian female Bolsheviks succeeded in organizing for the first time the celebration of International Women's Day. More than 2,000 people took part in the meeting. In the summer of 1913, Работница, Working Women magazine, began to be published. But the ideologists of the revolutionary approach to the issue of women's rights argued not to trust the calls of bourgeois feminists and not to participate in their campaigns. In 1916, Moscow Department of Russian League of Women's Equality, headed by Anna Shabanova, proposed a meeting to discuss creating All-Russian Women's Union. Many feminist organizations supported the idea. In March 1917, when the Second Russian Bourgeois Democratic Revolution forced Russian autocracy to collapse, the League members decided to continue their struggle. On March 19, 1917, more than 40,000 women came to take part in a demonstration in front of temporary government residence in St. Petersburg, in the capital. Their streamers and slogans read, "Women's place is in the assembly. Suffrage to women. Women unite. Women's workers are demanding their rights to vote. Right to vote cannot be universal without women." Not being satisfied with assurances made by Nikolai Chkhiidze, the chairman of the Council of Workers, and Mikhail Rodzianko, the chairman of the State Duma, to support women's struggles for their rights, the demonstrators promised not to leave until they received the insurance arrangements from Prince Grigory Lvov, the chairman of the Council of Ministers. He turned out to be the one to take responsibility to confirm universal suffrage as the right for both sexes. On March 21st, Grigory Lvov met with the delegates of Liga, Vera Figner, Ariadna Tyrkova, Anna Shabanova, and Sofia Panina, and again confirmed, on behalf of the government, its intentions to exercise women's political equality. In May-August 1917, during elections to state and local dumas, the Party of Constitutional Democrats was the one that promoted most candidates, 12%. Bolsheviks had 10% and social revolutionaries 7%. Women's League leaders had to admit that this result was only formally a success. Up to the October events of 1917, both political parties and broad electorate were not ready to recognize women's right to participate in administration of the state. The Conference of Women's Workers of Petrograd region in November 1917 was the last forum that Russian feminists participated in on the official level. Alexandra Kollontai, who attended the event, asked the participants to listen to the representative of Russian League of Women's Equality, Dr. Drashevskaya, so that women workers would know who is their enemy now. This was followed by Drashevskaya arguing that men cannot defend women's interests since they don't understand them. However, this statement drowned in the din of disagreement, such signified the end of liberal Russian feminism of the first wave. Bolshevik decrees of late 1917, early 1918 prohibited the work of all feminist organizations together with the activity of other parties and unions except Bolshevik Party. The period from October 1917 to the early 30s can be called the Great Experiment. The first Soviet decrees promised a lot to women. The new Soviet Constitution of 1918 immediately granted women equal rights under the law. Actual equality proved to be more difficult to attain. In political realm, equality meant most of all the communist education of women, bringing them into the ranks of party members and ultimately investing them in government positions. Lenin's comment of the subject became a virtual aphorism in the USSR. Even a kitchen maid can lead the government. And therefore, it's necessary to involve women in politics. In order to involve women in political activity, Lenin directed that every party organization establish women's sections, Zhenotdeli, that even in October 1990, when the civil war was still in progress. The Zhenotdeli constituted a special governmental and party apparatus for work with women. The main goal of the Zhenotdeli was to retrain in ideologically human resources, that is, to inculcate in women communist ideas. The Bolsheviks did not have evil intentions in this regard. On the contrary, they believed that resistance to communist ideas sprang from ignorance. A characteristic slogan of the period read, "Within the iron hand, we will drive humanity to happiness." While the party sponsored its own organizations for women, it harshly condemned any other non-party women's groups. In order to achieve equality between men and women in the family, the Bolsheviks introduced a whole range of important reforms. One of the first reforms, enacted in December 1917, was the Decree on Civil Marriage, which replaced ecclesiastical control over marriage with governmental oversight. Decrees protected women and children during pregnancy and nursing, mandating maternity leave. For the first time in Europe, women could keep their maiden name. Another first time, in 1920, was realized feminist demand to regulate reproductive rights by recognizing women's right for abortion. The legislation on marriage of 1926 made the so-called de facto marriage, common law marriage, legal. If a man and woman lived together and set up a common household and budget, they were considered married. The divorce procedure became utterly simplified. One of the spouses could send a postcard to the Department of Registering Civil Acts. For the first time in history, illegitimate children could enjoy the same rights as those born in married couples. Presumption of a mother being always right in identifying a father was introduced as well. It was sufficient for a mother to write petition stating the father. However, these legislation norms never resulted in equal opportunities with men. The state gradually took upon itself the paternalistic role of a father and patriarch. This is metaphorically expressed by the activists of women's movement of 1920s, Alexandra Kollontai, Inessa Armand, Nadezhda Krupskaya, Sofia Smedovich, who tried to assure the mothers that the socialist state would always support them, regardless of marital bonds. Motherhood was defined as the social responsibility, which was supposed to supplement women's responsibility to work on equal terms with men. These attitudes referred as the solution of women's issue, in reality did not liberate women, having simply made their lives more difficult. However, this aspect was not admitted during public debates at that time. The emotional ties within families were being destroyed. Family instability had become women's burden and made their partners even less responsible for the loved ones. The weakening of family norms brought about by women the orientation to be involved into work and public and political life led to decreased birth rate, not more than one child per family. How did women react to all these new laws and attitudes after the Russian Revolution? Women's reactions varied. Some educated women were inspired by the grand transformation of society and believed that anything was possible. Others regarded the situation pessimistically, believing that all the efforts would yield little. Women workers who entered unions and party and state organizations felt themselves a part of the process of building a new society. They readily sacrificed their free time, health, energy, and happiness for the sake of promised future. By 1930s, the situation had reached a critical point, and family policy witnessed a traditionalist backlash. The consolidation of Stalin's rule in the 1930s was marked by a reversal of women's fortunes. Because Russia had no tradition of bourgeois democracy, it found itself once again under autocracy, this time under Bolshevik Party. It is not surprising that the Soviet Union of the 1930s resurrected the ecclesiastically based ideas of the pre-revolutionary period. A new law concerning marriage was issued in 1936 under the guise of gilding women and strengthening the family. The law made divorce more complicated. 8 years later, it became only possible to get divorced through court. The concept of spousal duty came into circulation of ideological and political manipulating. In 1936, abortions were banned as well. Those who performed illegal abortions could be sentenced to a minimum of 2 years in a Siberian labor camp. Discussion of sex disappeared from the pages of magazines. Sexuality turned out to be closely linked to reproductive behavior. In 1935, USSR stopped producing contraceptives, condoms. Women who somehow managed to obtain condoms washed and reused them. Despite these new restrictions on women's autonomy, women were still expected to participate equally with men in work in factories and collective farms. In accordance with Lenin's dictum to bring women into workplace, women were recruited for labor even in hazardous industries such as mining, metallurgy, and chemical manufacture. In 1931, 43,000 women worked in mines in the USSR. Traditional functions of division of labor had successfully come back to life. Under conditions of constant deficit of consumer goods, these functions were fully mobilized both before and after the World War II. During the World War II, Russian women began to work in spheres that had been before mostly or exclusively intended for men, managers of factory shops or directors of enterprises. These changes seemed to go unnoticed to the state, which saw women only as mothers and workers, you can see. After the end of war, women became easily driven out of their forced positions as leaders due to the growth of men's symbolic value. The Soviet press began to argue women to bear 10 or 12 children and to turn over child rearing to public daycare. To be honest, the cost of the daycare was minimal, and most women could afford to send their children. In 1955, a new law once again legalized abortion for the purpose of preventing illegal ones. But the continuing lack of alternative forms of contraception meant that abortion became the major method of birth control in the USSR. Even today, Russia leads the world in the number of abortions. From the 1950 to the 1981, abortions are performed without anesthesia and are a punishing procedure for women. Authorities feared making abortions too painless, lest women seek them more often. However, this policy was not supported by sex education. There was no public or media debates on the matter till mid-1980s. During the period of political thaw, 1956-1964, women again became aware of their unequal equality. Women shared with men an equal burden of work outside the home and also had the burden of being wives, mothers, and housekeepers. The official party goal of this period was to achieve harmonious combination of motherhood with a more active participation of women in the labor force. However, nobody knew how to achieve it. The era of economic stagnation that followed 1964, mid-1980s, were marked by doubts in viewing some social issues as fully resolved. Women's issue was one of them. The Soviet state no longer exercised strict regulations over construction, partial rehabilitation of private life, increased autonomy of the family. Women were granted paid maternity leave a month and a month before the birth, and months and a half afterwards. Mothers with young children received 3 extra days of vacation time. In 1967, fixed child support in case of divorce was introduced 25% of the salary earned by the spouse who left the family. The Code of Marriage of 1968 stipulated welfare benefits for single mothers. All these measures objectively improved women's situation. However, just like the abortion issues, women's inequality with men on the level of day-to-day life, smaller opportunities for professional growth of higher salaries were not still open for discussion. In contrast to motherhood, fatherhood was never talked about. The ideology continued to be persistent in treating correct femininity as identical to motherhood. The status of working mother was proclaimed as an achievable ideal. It was supported by the resilience of patriarchal attitudes in the upbringing of girls as those responsible to serve men at home and take care of their health. By late 1970s, it had become clear that combining the roles of a working woman and mother was quite complicated. It was now believed that women had become overly masculinized. To overcome this problem, women were supposed to return back to the family. The Committee of Soviet Women was the only women's organization allowed to function. It was nothing more than a marionette in the hands of the ideological department of the Communist Party Central Committee. By early 1980s, there were about 20% of women among the party members. However, the leading ranks only numbered 2%, and there was not a single woman in the Central Committee itself. The authorities tried to officially ignore these discrepancies. In 1979, when the UN adopted the Convention of Liquidating All Forms of Discrimination Regarding Women, Soviet propaganda assumed that the Russian legislation had long been in full compliance with the international standards, and that all the norms of the convention were irrelevant to the USSR, since that had been long since implemented. The greatest achievement concerning women in the late Brezhnev era was the recognition that the woman question had not been resolved. Just before Gorbachev epoch, that was called the remnants of factual inequality still remained after the solution of women's question. The resurrection of feminism in late 1970s is a special page in the women's history movement, in the history of women's movement. The USSR witnessed the rebirth of feminism as a reaction to the Soviet emancipation. Some women from large cities, mostly capitals of Soviet republics, became involved in human rights movement. They were mostly engaged in basic draft and not leading work, as typists, proofreaders, binders. The characteristic feature of Soviet women dissidents, Natalia Gorbanevskaya, Lydia Alexeyeva, and others, you can see them, was a combination of radical views, rational approach to carrying out tasks, and deep conviction in the rightfulness of their cause. Since their male colleagues proved to be reluctant to publish materials on women issues in the most influential of some adult self-publishing journals, a group of Leningrad human rights advocates, Natalia Malakhovskaya, Tatiana Goricheva, Tatiana Mamonova, and Yulia Voznesenskaya, decided to seize the initiative to uncrown the myth of problemless women's fate in the USSR. In 1979, they created an almanac, Women and Russia, which had been arrested by the KGB on its way out. Helena Daron, Tatiana Mikhailova, and others joined the group somewhat later, when the issues of publishing a regular magazine, Maria, had been raised. The opening part of its first issue was the appeal to women in Russia. At the end, It called upon turning the women's values, which are currently abused, and seeking spiritual foundation of all spheres, from religious and theoretical to daily life. Leningrad feminists, supported by their Western colleagues, made themselves known as a totally new democratic community in actions, since they criticized intolerance to alternative way of thinking. The feminists tried to orient their followers to share the values of non-violence and creativity. Similar to the Russian feminists of the first wave, late 19th century, they did not view their movement as anti-male one, and together with the liberals of the 20th century denied equality feminism. They believed it discredited itself in the USSR, and argued for feminism of differences, the development of women in all the beauty and fullness of its gender. The specific feature of Russian feminism of the time, re-established in an illegal basis, was its close connection to Russian Orthodox Church. The feminists viewed Mother Mary as their symbol. What was their reaction to the equality of sexless Slavs that the protest against atheist ideological system? Now we're speaking about Russian feminism of the second wave, from the late 1980s to the present. The reforms of mid-1980s changed women's position in the Russian society. They created conditions for new forms of women's movement, the emergence of many public associations. They began to struggle not just formal and legal gender equality, but the real one. The absolute majority of new and existing organizations that upheld the interests of women preferred to be called precisely women's. That time, the term feminism and its derivatives were associated in public consciousness with something negative, politicized, ideological, brought in from the West in unnecessary in Russia. This was an artifact from Soviet past during the struggle for women's rights, separate from broader struggle of the proletariat, was considered bourgeois and thus pointless. The first women's groups calling themselves independent started to appear already in 1980s. They were the ones who openly cast doubt on the experience of resolving the women's question in the USSR, showing that it is not resolved, that women formally did not enjoy equal right with men, and there was no real equality to be spoken at all. They openly put themselves in opposition to the party dictating the country, saying that there had been no emancipation of women in the Soviet era at all. March 29, 1991, in the city of Dubna, not far from Moscow, the first independent women's forum, uniting more than 70 organizations, took place. In 1992, the second forum was held. The meetings in Dubna clearly demonstrated the uselessness of the already long inactive Committee of Soviet Women and liquidated its monopoly in the solution of women's problem. Now, this committee is called Union of Russian Women, and it still exists. In 215, this union even celebrated 25 years anniversary. In this first stage, the reborn Russian women's movement focused on identifying the tasks and goals of its activities. The idea of human rights did not get much attention because the country was in an economic crisis and unemployment had women's face. The second stage of Russian post-Soviet women's movement from 1993. We can connect with women organizations of 1990s. These organizations began to seek ways to cooperate with government authorities in the party political system. The number of organizations in that time rose to 300. It was at this stage that the task appeared of gender education of society, spreading knowledge about human rights and women's rights in context of unrealized human rights. The main event of the period was the victory of Women of Russia movement in the State Duma elections of 1993 with 8% of the vote. As a result of this, first women's parliamentary faction in the Russian history was formed, headed by Ekaterina Lakhova. Here is here. Despite the fact that the faction was quite effective in general conservatism of the political culture of Russians, prevented them from winning in the elections after 1995. Till today, but the activeness of women in 1990s left its mark on political life. Parties began to include far more women in their lists. In the Russian Academy of Sciences, Russian Academy of Education, in universities and other institutions of higher education, groups, laboratories, and departments of women and gender studies began to appear just in 1990s. Women's movement from this period began to be understood not only as the actions of women's groups and social organizations made up of women, but also as a certain style of thinking, similar to Western liberal feminism. In the third stage of the rebirth of feminism in Russia after 1995 till present, its main goals are the self-determination of the movement in the context of the civil society, and forms of action and discussion about forms of action within it. 15 years ago, the Ministry of Justice had registered more than 650 women's groups. Now their number increased to 1,400. 9 of them had federal status: the Russian socio-political movement Women of Russia, then Women's League, Union of Women in Russia, and so on. Recently, Russian feminist organizations have been advocating principles of social partnership, joint participation in the solution of serious social problems, violence, homeless children, drug addiction, and pregnant women, and so on. This process has been helped by the creation in 1998 of the Information Center of the Independent Women's Forum and the Consortium of Women's Non-Governmental Organizations, which focus on lobbying women's interests at various levels of government. But the more things change, the more they remain the same. In April 404, Putin's administration eliminated the Commission on Women's Issues in our Duma. Women's question is once again proclaimed as being resolved. In recent years, after 200, the women's movement, and specifically its feminist manifestations, have entered a serious crisis. In the 1990s, the majority of feminist groups existed in an atmosphere of general political liberalism and operated with the support of Western organizations. However, the situation changed drastically in 200 due to Vladimir Putin's and United Russia party's rise to power. Almost immediately thereafter, a political reversal occurred associated with the outright rejection of liberalism and the devaluing of human rights movement. At the same time, Western sponsors calculated that their work in Russia essentially was complete, and consequently curtailed their programs. Being deprived of financial support and sensing the change in the social and political climate, many activist groups simply ceased to exist. As a result, no organized really feminist movement operates on the territory of the Russian Federation today. But a lot of women's organizations continue to exist at a grassroots level. They attempt to resolve practical issues that their members face daily, and often they receive state support, but pointedly distance themselves from traditional feminists and are far removed from the aims of the feminist agenda. Uniting such grassroots organizations into a very real political force is only a dream of now. The convocation, you can see it on the picture, of the second All-Russian Women's Congress in 2008 confirmed the existence of a conspicuous divide within the Russian women's movement, you can see on this photo. On the one side, we would like to see the liberal-minded feminists leading towards the West, but there are only few such groups, special sections or departments at the universities. Russian feminists criticized Western feminism for an unilateral knowledge exchange, creating asymmetric relationships and putting Russian women into the position of a pupil that can only imitate its Western tutor. And on the other side, the conservative Russian Union of Orthodox women. Between them were ordinary women earnestly trying to resolve the everyday pressing problems of the average Russian woman. Established in 2009, the Committee for the Consolidation of Women's Movements in Russia to date has been unable to pacify these competing political actors. Anti-government protests in Russia in the last 10 years are taking many different forms, from mass rallies and marches to defiance, street art and music. On 21st February 2012, 5 young women, members of a feminist punk group which calls itself Pussy Riot, clothed in brightly colored short skirts, night tights and rudely made balaclavas, ruptured the silence of the Cathedral of Christ, the Savior in Moscow, Russia, with an obscenely laced song asking the Virgin Mary to deliver Russia from the impending re-election of its former president, Vladimir Putin. The Russian government responded to this provocative but not violent act with unexpected coercive force against the small group of activists. The rejection of Pussy Riot made by a large segment of post-Soviet society is related to two factors. First, the group members practice media activism and belong with new social movements of the post-industrial era. They challenge cultural codes and messages and rely on the language and concepts that target Western rather than post-Soviet audiences. And second, the group exemplifies the new social divisions and boundaries that arise in post-social society during the information age. They are perceived by many Russians as cosmopolitan elites produced by global capitalism. For the conclusion, we have to underline that the meanings and goals of feminism are not universal, and they depend on particular locations, social contexts, and time periods. Through the 1990s and into a new millennium, women's NGOs have made some visible gains in terms of the numbers of organizations existing and the extent of networks among organizations. There have also been some glimmers of success, particularly at regional levels, in developing dialogue with government agencies concerning the policy goals of women's NGOs. But the women's movement in Russia continues to be plagued by internal and external problems that are unquestionably formidable. It remains largely depoliticized, fragmented, and detached from its purported constituency of women. These problems have implications not only for the development of a women's movement, but also for the strength of democratic institutions in Russia. Thanks. Perhaps.
15 minutes for questions.
If you have some, or perhaps you would like to say some words about the whole women's movement in compare with yours, with American, with what do you know about American women's movement, and is it similar to the path that we have passed during these years or not? Yes, I have hearing you.
I have a very boring, very specific question. So you mentioned that at several points there have been these divisions within the feminist movements in Russian history. Thinking back to the 1860s, when you were talking about sort of the very beginning of all this, were there divisions between aristocratic supporters of women's rights and sort of more radical groups as early as the 1860s, or did that division develop later?
A little bit later, in 1870s, when aristocratic women were out of the movement, and the whole history is the history of this undergoing, how to say it in English, undergoing social mobility, because at first there were a lot of aristocrats and that had money and can obtain this money, and later on it were разночинцы. No, this I don't know this word in English. So the women that were born not in aristocratic families, but in middle class, urban middle class, perhaps so. Yes, to say. Yes.
Well, there is a big movement of Russian brides, and what, they're
Russian brides?
Russian brides. Many women in Russia want to marry someone who is outside of Russia and travel and find a husband.
It is not movement.
Not a social movement, but I get to see the other side of it. So what does the women's rights movement in Russia think about that? What kind of
I think
guidance or
I think that there is no problem. I see no problem in this interest of Russian women to marry somebody abroad. So it only, I think that all young women are thinking about interest in life without difficulties, and this way they can choose this way of marriage to get abroad and to live abroad.
Well, there are some very big issues that it have to do with women's rights. Generally, it's a certain type of a person that would come, let's say, from the United States on these tours, and sometimes they come here, they have absolutely no support of the family. Sometimes the husband turns out to be very abusive and takes advantage of them, and there's no government structures in Russia to protect women and to screen those potential suitors.
I think that this we can see only last 20 years or 25 years. So after this fairy curtain is fall down, and our women became person who can go away, go abroad, and to have correspondence by letters and now by internet with somebody abroad, and to go away, and perhaps we have to do we have to speak with such women and to have special groups or somebody who can explain the ways to get in more successful and in another way, not only by marriage.
The reason why I'm talking about this is that as part of my work, I get to see the dark side
Mm-hmm.
of the Russian brides,
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote.
Yeah.
business.
Perhaps I cannot answer this question because for the first time you gave me this question and I have to think about this really perhaps you see all this from this country where our brides are common and so and they have problems here we haven't heard about it. So as a lot of problems. Well. Yes.
Thank you for this talk. I wanted to ask you about the sort of earlier historical origins that
Mhm.
you traced. Generally, what you traced was the sort of liberal political tradition,
Mhm.
although at the end you talked about Orthodox women's
Mhm.
organizations. I wonder how work on Orthodox women's self-fulfillment, like Brenda Meehan's work, might fit into your narrative.
Too much for me. I cannot understand the direction of the question.
Do you know Brenda Meehan, her work on Orthodox women in the 18th and 19th century?
No. I haven't heard. Perhaps there are a lot of publications abroad about also about women's movement in Russia, and it's very hard to follow all these publications and to know all these names of researchers. But if somebody is interested in corresponding with us, we have special organization, Russian Association for Research in Women's History, that can give this possibility to speak and to discuss every year because we are organizing special conferences in different cities in Russia. And every year we have special panel about Russian women's movement and a lot of interesting colleagues from the other cities coming. If it's possible to give our coordinates to this person that you have mentioned now, it will be nice to have connections also with her, because this problem, the problem of connections between Orthodox Church and women's movement is very actual. For this time, for this day, for today, is very, very, because earlier we thought that the problems of women's movement are connected only with Western ideas of feminism or with liberal movement in the West and in atheist movement also in Russia and in the West. And now we understand that there are a lot of problems that we can discuss also with Orthodox Church, where we cannot say that our women organizations are supported by Orthodox Church, but some of women organizations are supported by Church, and it is necessary to speak with all of them and not to stay in somewhere out marginem and not to hear another voices that our. So I can say. So. I hope the questions are over.
I'll just, I was just curious, sorry, this is back into historical question, but you spoke about how in the 1860s there was a society for women's labor established. And this is in the similarities and differences between Western feminism and Russian feminism. But in the West, industrialization and women moving into cities and for factory work was a big part. Big impetus for the movement. So I was wondering what kind of labor these societies were established. Was it also factory work or what sort of
Factory worker, and first of all metallists. In metal industry, how to say it? metallurgy industry, mines, metallurgy industry, and textile workers. But the most educated persons were in pechatniki, so typographists, printers, the most educated part of working society, and the most part of educated women also, from this niveau, from this social strata. And there were a lot of such enterprises somewhere on the in Belarus, in Litauen, in this part of Russia, where so in western part of Russian Empire. So.
Thank you.
I had a question going off of Dr. Lawless. I was wondering if women were confined to so-called spheres of light industry then, or could they also enter the heavy industry sort of factories? Because you mentioned during World War II, they occupied spheres that men had. Were these like heavy industries, such as coal mining, or very
Yeah,
dangerous
very cool. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in comparison with East Central Europe, where they had to work in textile factories and light industry, women in the Soviet Union could work in heavy industry.
Yep. During the whole Soviet period, even now, they can work in heavy industry. And they are not against it, because the most high salaries they receive just on these very hard works. And it was possible also in Tsarist Russia and also in Soviet Union. And now there are a lot of, how to say it, this part of welfare organizations and public health organizations. They are against of training women in such and using women's labor in such enterprises and so on. But there are a lot of women that are against such discussions, and they are saying, give us a possibility to work and to receive these high salaries. So it is.
So in terms of women's labor force participation today in Russia, are women continue to be in the labor force, or are they pulled back?
No, they are continue to be in the labor force, really. And this concept of working mother is also, it's not abolished. It's absolutely just as in Soviet era, So nothing had changed, and we have to change something. So thank you. Thank you for all of you. Thank you.